Simone had endured all. The side eyes in meetings, the patronizing tones, and the hushed whispers that followed her through the halls. As a black woman in a world dominated by prejudice, she was used to being overlooked, undermined, and underestimated. But the ultimate humiliation came when her manager, dripping with disdain, fired her in front of the entire office, reducing her years of hard work to nothing. Little did they know, the very walls they stood within held a secret that would turn their smug arrogance into bitter regret. The air inside Caldwell Enterprises was thick with unease, an unspoken tension that had seeped into the walls like a stain. The newest manager, Ethan Caldwell, prowled the open office floor like a predator assessing his territory. Everything about him screamed control. The perfectly pressed suit, the gleaming watch on his wrist, the pointed glances he threw at his subordinates. Simone Harris sat quietly at her desk, typing away on her laptop. She was the kind of employee who went unnoticed by choice, a woman who preferred her work to speak for her. She wore her hair in a neat bun, her crisp blouse devoid of any flamboyance, but her calm demeanor held an authority that couldn't be ignored. For years, she had been the silent backbone of this company, the one who solved problems before they reached critical mass. Ethan noticed her, though. He noticed the way her colleagues sought her advice, the quiet confidence in her every movement. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just her competence. It was the ease with which she navigated the space, as though she belonged. And in Ethan's mind, she didn't. "Simone," he called out one morning, his voice cutting through the hum of the office. Everyone paused, pretending to be engrossed in their work while their ears strained to catch the exchange. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." Simone replied, looking up from her screen. Her tone was polite, even professional, but there was an unmistakable steadiness in her gaze. "This report," he said, slamming a file onto her desk. "It's late. Again." Simone frowned, her fingers brushing the corner of the file. "That's not possible. I emailed it last week, and I have a timestamp to prove it." Ethan's jaw tightened. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, but not his intensity. "I'm not here to argue with you, Simone. Fix it." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Simone nodded once, picked up the file, and turned back to her laptop without another word. The confrontation fizzled, but the undercurrent of hostility lingered like smoke after a fire. It was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a series of deliberate slights. Ethan would dismiss Simone's ideas in meetings, even when they were objectively the best solutions. He started assigning her menial tasks, things far below her pay grade, and criticized her work openly in front of others. Angela Carter, Simone's closest friend at the office, noticed. One day during lunch, she leaned across the table, her voice low. "He's got it out for you." Simone smiled faintly, stirring her tea. Men, like Ethan, always do. It's nothing new. "You can't just let him get away with it," Angela pressed. "I'm not letting him get away with anything," Simone replied, her tone cryptic. "I'm just waiting." Ethan, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Simone's composed exterior, continued his campaign. His behavior escalated until the day he finally snapped. The morning had started like any other. Employees filtered into the office, the air filled with the sounds of clicking keyboards and the low hum of conversation. Ethan stood at the head of the weekly team meeting, a PowerPoint presentation flickering on the screen behind him. Simone sat at the end of the table, her leather notebook open in front of her. She was jotting down notes when Ethan suddenly turned his attention to her. "Simone," he said, his voice sharp. "Yes. This data you provided, it's incomplete." Simone raised an eyebrow. "It's based on the information James sent me last week. If there's an issue, I can double-check the numbers." Ethan's face darkened. "Excuses." He tossed the printed report across the table, the pages scattering. "You're always full of excuses." The room went silent. No one dared to intervene. Simone closed her notebook slowly, her movements deliberate. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, If you have specific concerns, I'd be happy to address them. But I'd appreciate it if we could keep this professional." Ethan's laugh was cold. "Professional? That's rich, coming from you." The insult hung in the air, heavier than the tension that had been building for weeks. Simone's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. "You know what? I'm done. You're fired." The words hit like a slap. Angela gasped. James, sitting near the middle of the table, avoided everyone's eyes. Simone didn't flinch. She rose from her seat, gathering her belongings with the same measured calm she always carried. As she walked toward the elevator, she paused to glance at Mr. Donovan, the janitor who had been watching from the corner of the room. "Funny how things work out," Donovan murmured, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. Simone gave him a small, knowing smile before stepping into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, Ethan turned back to the room, a self-satisfied grin on his face. "Let that be a lesson," he announced, his voice brimming with smugness. "This is my office now, and I won't tolerate incompetence." But what Ethan didn't know, what no one except Simone and a handful of others knew, was that she owned more than her dignity. She owned the building. As the elevator doors closed behind Simone, she exhaled slowly, her face calm, betraying none of the tumult within her. She stood motionless for a moment, feeling the rise and fall of her chest, the weight of the confrontation hanging in the air. The steel walls of the elevator reflected her image back at her, composed, collected, the professional mask firmly in place. Yet beneath it, there was something else, a quiet storm that had been brewing for years. The elevator descended, the soft hum of the cables above cutting through the silence. Simone glanced down at her hands, the ones that had worked so diligently for this company, hands that had crafted proposals, built relationships, fixed what others had broken, hands that had just been dismissed like they were nothing. But Simone was not nothing. As the elevator doors slid open to lobby, she stepped out, walking through the sleek marble floors with the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly where they were headed. The receptionist gave her a polite, if distracted, nod. Simone returned it with a faint smile before crossing to the back exit, where she pulled out a set of keys from her bag, a set that belonged not to a mere employee but to the very heart of the building. Simone's first stop was a small office on the 16th floor. The door was locked, but the key turned effortlessly in the lock. Inside, the space was pristine, untouched, save for a few personal items scattered on the desk, a photo of a younger Simone with her parents, a stack of legal papers, and a half-drunk coffee cup that had long since gone cold. She walked to the corner of the room and pulled back a section of carpet, revealing a small trapdoor. Her fingers were steady as she lifted it, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. This wasn't a place for the faint-hearted. It was a hidden part of the building that only a select few knew about, a space that held the company's most valuable assets. And now, it would hold her secret. Simone took a deep breath and descended the stairs, the faint light from her phone illuminating the path. As she walked, the walls seemed to close in on her, a stark contrast to the open, airy spaces of the corporate floors above. The hidden passageway was a reminder of the world she had long kept hidden from the others, a world of quiet power and long-buried truths. At the bottom of the stairs was a single door, guarded by another lock. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a second key, different from the one she had used before. It fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the door swung open to reveal a room that could only be described as a vault, both literal and metaphorical. The room was lined with documents, contracts, and blueprints, each one more valuable than the last. But at the center, resting on a steel table, was the final piece of the puzzle, a framed photograph of the building itself, a symbol of everything she had fought for. This was where it all began, the reason she had stayed in the shadows for so long, the reason she had taken her time to play the game. Her fingers brushed against the glass of the frame as her mind raced back through the years, to the day she had first walked into this building, fresh out of college, eager to prove herself. Back then, She had been told time and again that this was a place for people like Ethan, people who came from wealth, from power, people who had the right connections, people who were never questioned, never doubted. But Simone had never been like them. She had come from a different world, one where opportunities weren't handed to you, where success had to be earned in a system rigged against you. She had learned that nothing was given, that every step forward came with a price, and that if you didn't fight for your place, you would be swept away. And she had fought. Hours later, Simone found herself in a small, inconspicuous cafe, the only place in the city that could offer the solitude she craved. She sat at the far corner, sipping her coffee slowly as she stared out the window. The storm had broken, and the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the city streets below. She had always loved this time of day, when the world seemed to pause, just for a moment. But today, the world felt different. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the familiar contacts, and paused when she saw the name she had been avoiding for years. Gwen Riley. Gwen had been one of Simone's few allies in the beginning, a mentor who had shown her the ropes of corporate life. But over the years, Gwen had distanced herself, leaving Simone to navigate the treacherous waters alone. Simone had always respected Gwen's decision, until now. Gwen had no idea what Simone was about to do, but she would soon find out. Simone tapped out a message, her fingers flying over the screen. "We need to talk. It's time." She hit send, and without another glance at the phone, she returned her attention to the bustling streets outside. A shift was coming, and the storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. Back at Caldwell Enterprises, Ethan had just finished a meeting with his assistant, James Walters, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Simone's former colleague, Angela. "You may have made a mistake today. She's not just another employee." Ethan scoffed, dismissing the message without a second thought. He didn't need anyone to tell him what he already knew. He was the one in control. He had crushed Simone, and that was the end of it. But something about Angela's words gnawed at him, a feeling in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't shake. He shook his head, muttering to himself. She was nothing. But was she? Simone stood at the threshold of the building that had once been her prison, her heart thundering in her chest. The keys in her hand weren't just to a set of doors. They were the key to everything. The next steps would be crucial. The world had underestimated her. Ethan had underestimated her. And now, she would make them all see who she really was. Simone's phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the screen. This time, the message was from Gwen, her old mentor, a voice from her past that had once guided her through the labyrinth of corporate life. She opened it, reading the words carefully. "I've been hearing rumors, Simone. Are you sure about this?" Simone's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Gwen had always been cautious, a little too cautious. She had learned long ago that sometimes, to survive, you had to take risks. And today, Simone was prepared to take the biggest one of all. She typed a response, her fingers slow and deliberate. "It's time, Gwen. I've been waiting long enough." The message sent, and she put the phone down, her thoughts spinning like the gears of an intricate clock, each decision she had made over the years coming to a head. For too long, she had been the quiet, diligent worker, the one who kept her head down and played the game by everyone else's rules. But those rules had never been written for someone like her. They had been written for people like Ethan, who thought power was something you inherited, not something you earned. She had been patient, biding her time, learning the ins and outs of the company and the building it occupied. She had watched every board meeting, every power struggle, every tiny shift in the dynamics of the office, and she had known that one day, the time would come when she could turn the tables. And now, that time had arrived. Ethan Caldwell, in the meantime, was already basking in the glow of his apparent victory. He had enjoyed his little triumph over Simone, the way her dignity crumbled in the face of his wrath. His office was pristine, the polished wood gleaming in the afternoon light. His thoughts drifted back to the satisfaction he had felt when she had walked out, her head held high, but her eyes downcast. She had been nothing to him, a mere obstacle, now eliminated. But then his phone buzzed with an incoming email, and his smile faltered when he saw the subject line, "Urgent, building ownership status." Frowning, he clicked it open, and the words he read made his stomach twist. It wasn't a mistake. He had assumed that Simone was just another mid-level employee, a cog in the machine, easily replaceable. But now, he was learning just how wrong he had been. Simone Harris didn't just work in the building. She owned it. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the revelation sinking in like cold water. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the screen in disbelief. How had he missed this? The email outlined in detail the ownership structure of Caldwell Enterprises office building, and the name that stood at the top, in bold letters, was Simone Harris. His thoughts raced as he reread the email, trying to piece together the puzzle. The company had always been owned by a holding firm that he thought was too distant to be relevant. What he hadn't realized was that Simone, using a series of strategic investments and holdings, had quietly acquired a controlling stake in the building without anyone's knowledge. Ethan's heart began to pound. He had fired the wrong person. Simone wasn't just some subordinate he could crush under his boot. She was the very foundation of the business. If she wanted to, she could end his career, seize control of the entire building, and completely dismantle everything he had built here. Simone didn't wait long. She knew Ethan would soon realize his mistake. After all, he wasn't the kind of man to take a blow to his ego lying down. As night fell over the city, she made her way back to the building. The streets were quieter now, the neon lights casting long shadows across the sidewalks. She approached the entrance with purpose, the keys cold in her hand. The building, once a symbol of corporate oppression, now felt like a sanctuary. She unlocked the front doors and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty lobby. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, and the overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a muted glow over the marble floors. Simone had always loved the quiet of the building at night, when all the voices and chaos were absent, leaving only the echo of her own thoughts. Tonight, the silence fell heavier, more significant, as though the building itself was aware of the change that was about to take place. She made her way to the elevator, her fingers brushing the cold buttons as she pressed the one that would take her to the 16th floor. The elevator ascended smoothly, the steady hum of the cables beneath her feet almost calming. She stared at her reflection in the polished metal doors, the same woman who had walked in here years ago. Only now, she was no longer just a cog in the machine. She was the one pulling the strings. When the elevator doors opened to the 16th floor, Simone stepped out into the same office she had worked in for so many years. The air was still, thick with the lingering tension of the day. She could hear Ethan's voice from down the hall, his furious tirade as he yelled at someone over the phone, his words sharp with panic. Simone didn't rush. She walked slowly toward the glass doors of Ethan's office, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. Inside, Ethan was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, unaware of her approach. Get the legal team on this. Find out who's responsible for this mess. This cannot happen. Do you understand? His voice was frantic now, his composure slipping away with every passing second. Simone smiled to herself, a quiet sense of triumph settling in her chest. She reached the door and paused, just long enough for the sound of her presence to reach Ethan. He turned sharply, his eyes widening as he saw her standing in the doorway. The phone slipped from his hand, crashing to the floor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "What do you want, Simone?" She stepped into the office, her gaze steady, unwavering. "What do I want? I want you to understand that you made a mistake today. You assumed you had power, but I've been holding the cards all along." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, placing it on his desk. Ethan's eyes flickered to the papers inside. His face drained of color as he recognized the documents, the building's ownership papers, signed and sealed with her name. "You can't." His words faltered. "You can't do this." Simone's voice was calm, almost soothing. "Oh, but I can. You fired me, Ethan. And now, I'm taking back what's mine." In that moment, Ethan Caldwell realized he'd been playing a game he didn't understand, and Simone was the one holding all the pieces. Simone stood in the sleek, glass-walled lobby of the building she had fought for years to own, staring at her reflection in the polished marble floors. The weight of the decision that had brought her here, standing at the threshold of her triumph, felt heavier than she had imagined. Her victory was now within arm's reach, yet the road ahead was clouded with uncertainty. Ethan Caldwell, with his ruthless arrogance, had made her an enemy, but it wasn't just him anymore. Now, there were new forces at play, forces she wasn't sure she could control. The phone buzzed in her hand, jolting her from her thoughts. Simone's eyes flickered to the screen, an anonymous message, cryptic and urgent. "Someone is digging into your finances. Be careful." Her stomach tightened. She had known the risks, but this was something new. Someone had noticed, and they were coming for her. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. Someone else had uncovered the secret she'd kept hidden for years, her quiet ownership of the building, a stake she had carefully built, step by step, until it was strong enough to support her claims. Someone had connected the dots, and that someone was likely working for Ethan, trying to drag her into a public war she wasn't ready to fight. Simone clenched her jaw, pushing the fear aside. She wasn't going to let anyone undermine her now. She had too much at stake. Still, the pressure weighed on her. She had to act fast, but she couldn't do it alone. Her mind turned to Gwen Riley, her former mentor. Gwen had always been the one who told her to take it slow, to play the corporate game without showing her hand. But now Simone needed answers, and Gwen was the only one who could provide the advice she needed. She dialed Gwen's number, her thumb hesitating for a moment before pressing call. "Simone." Gwen's voice crackled through the line. "What is it? I thought you had your sights set on bigger things." "I do," Simone replied, her voice steady. "But I think someone's getting too close to the truth. I need help, more than you know." There was a long pause on the other end, a sharp intake of breath. Simone could almost hear the wheels turning in Gwen's mind. "You made a mess of things, haven't you?" "Maybe," Simone admitted, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the empty hallway in front of her. "But I'm not backing down now." "I don't know, Simone. Things are getting dangerous. You've got enemies at every turn." Simone's grip tightened on the phone. "If I can't trust you, Gwen, then who can I trust?" The line went silent for a beat, then a sigh. "I'll help. But you need to know, once you go down this path, there's no turning back." "I'm ready." Simone's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Angela Shaw, a woman who had become something of an ally in recent months. Angela had been one of the few who seemed to understand what Simone was after. They had worked together, navigating the treacherous waters of corporate politics, but there was always an edge to Angela, a hint of ambition in her eyes that made Simone uneasy. The message was blunt. "We need to meet. There's something I found out." Simone's heart raced as she replied, "Meet me at my office in 20 minutes. We don't have time to waste." When Angela arrived, there was no small talk. She walked straight into the room, her eyes narrowed with purpose. "Simone, I have information. Information about Caldwell Enterprises and Ethan's dirty dealings. We've both been playing this game for too long. It's time to make a move." Simone's gaze sharpened. "What kind of information?" Angela's lips curled into a thin smile, the kind that could destroy him. Simone felt a rush of excitement mixed with caution. This was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. But Angela's motives were always unclear. What did Angela want in exchange for this intel? Before she could voice her suspicions, the door to her office opened without warning. James Walters, Ethan's assistant, stepped inside, looking uneasy. "Simone, we need to talk. It's about Ethan." Simone raised an eyebrow, unsure of his intentions. James had always been loyal to Ethan, had always been Ethan's right-hand man. But something had shifted in him lately. She could see the tension in his eyes, the conflict that gnawed at him. "I've been trying to protect you," James said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But I can't stand by while Ethan destroys everything. He's getting desperate, and I'm worried about what he might do next." Simone studied him, weighing his words carefully. Could she trust him? Her instincts told her that James wasn't just a pawn in Ethan's game anymore. He was playing a game of his own. Simone found herself pacing the quiet hallways of the building late one night, the weight of the day's revelations heavy on her mind. Ethan had launched his campaign against her, spreading rumors and trying to paint her as an unstable, unfit leader. But wasn't just a smear campaign that weighed on her. It was something much deeper, something she hadn't expected. It had come from Gwen. "You never knew, did you?" Gwen had said, her voice almost a whisper. "Your mother. She was involved in the company. More than you knew. She was part of it long before Ethan ever thought about taking over." Simone's breath had caught in her throat. She had always known her mother had ties to Caldwell Enterprises, but she hadn't realized how deep they ran. Simone's mother had been an original shareholder in the company, a woman whose business acumen had been overshadowed by the sexism of the time. She had tried to pass on that legacy to Simone, but the corporate world had chewed her up and spit her out. Now, Simone realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her mother's legacy. She was reclaiming what had been stolen from her family years ago. As the battle raged on, Simone grew closer to Angela, closer than she had ever intended. Angela seemed to be the perfect ally, a sharp mind in a world of deceit. But Simone had started to notice things, small things, like the way Angela looked at the power Simone was amassing. And there was the way she casually mentioned the future of the building, implying a shared vision. A vision that didn't necessarily include Simone as the sole leader. One night, after a tense meeting with Ethan's legal team, Simone returned to her office, only to find it ransacked. Papers were scattered everywhere, and her most sensitive documents were gone. Her heart sank. It was Angela. Simone knew it. She had been played. In a moment of bitter realization, Simone realized she had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted the most. Angela had been working with Ethan all along, feeding him information and making Simone believe they were working toward the same goal. The betrayal stung more than she had anticipated, but it also hardened her resolve. James, still grappling with his loyalty to Ethan, began to see the true extent of the chaos Ethan had caused. The walls were closing in on him, and James knew he had to make a choice. It wasn't just about taking sides anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. One evening, in a dimly lit corner of the building, James met Simone. "I can't do this anymore," he confessed. "Ethan, he's too far gone. He'll destroy everything for the sake of his ego. I can't follow him any longer. I'm with you." Simone met his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just maybe, she had found an ally who truly understood her fight. But the road ahead would not be easy. As James handed her a critical document, a piece of evidence that could bring Ethan to his knees, Simone knew this was just the beginning. Simone had always known the stakes. But now, with betrayal in her midst and a growing sense of urgency, she realized that the war wasn't just about power, it was about survival. And the game she was playing had only just begun. Simone stood at the edge of the penthouse, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below, a far cry from the darkness that had begun to encircle her life. She had come so far, but the closer she got to victory, the more it seemed like everything was slipping through her fingers. The stakes had never been higher. There was no turning back now. She had spent the past week tracking down every lead, putting together the puzzle of Ethan's wrongdoings. But with Angela's betrayal, she felt more isolated than ever. The allies she thought she had were no longer who they seemed. James had promised her loyalty, but even his presence now felt like a temporary fix. How could she trust anyone in a game where truth and lies were indistinguishable? The document James had given her, the one that could bring Ethan to his knees, was in her hands now, tucked into the pocket of her coat. It contained damning evidence of illegal activities that Ethan had been involved in for years. This was it. the final piece of the puzzle. Yet, even knowing its power, Simone hesitated. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she was standing at a precipice. The truth was both a weapon and a burden. Once unleashed, there would be no going back. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from Gwen. "It's time. Don't wait too long." Simone's hand tightened around the phone. She couldn't stall any longer. It was now or never. Simone walked into Ethan's office the next day with the weight of the world on her shoulders. The walls of the glass tower seemed to close in on her as she approached the heavy mahogany door. Every step echoed, her breath shallow, each thought twisting into another. Ethan was seated behind his desk, his back to her as he looked over financial reports, his brow furrowed in concentration. His calm demeanor was unnerving, as if he had already won, like he was the one in control, even though the walls were closing in on him. He didn't turn when she entered. "Simone," Ethan said with a cold smile, still not looking at her. "I knew you'd come. You always did like to take your time, but that's one of your many flaws. You wait until the last possible moment, and then you expect to have the upper hand. You never learn." Simone stood still, staring at his back. The tension between them crackled in the air, the room heavy with their shared history. She could feel the years of manipulation, deceit, and animosity weighing down on her. She knew what had to be done, but doing it, confronting him head-on, felt almost impossible. "You're wrong, Ethan." Simone finally spoke, her voice cold. "I've been patient, yes, but I'm done waiting, and I'm done playing your games." Ethan turned slowly, his smirk never faltering. "Really? And what exactly do you think you're going to do with that file in your hand?" His eyes flickered to the document she held, though she hadn't made any attempt to reveal it yet. "You're playing a dangerous game, Simone. I've already warned you." Simone took a deep breath. "It's not a game anymore, Ethan." She placed the file on the desk between them, the weight of it sinking into the air like a heavy stone. "This is what you've been hiding. This is what I've been working toward." Ethan's eyes flickered with something, anger, fear, a flash of vulnerability that was quickly masked. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this changes anything? You think you can beat me with that?" He slammed his fist down on the desk, the impact making Simone's heart skip a beat. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Simone stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "No," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But it changes everything for you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them in that sterile, imposing office. A battleground for power. And then, with a sudden, almost violent motion, Ethan grabbed the file and tore it open. His eyes scanned the pages, and for the first time, his confident facade faltered. He sat back in his chair, staring at the evidence as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Where did you get this?" His voice was sharp, but there was a trace of panic beneath it. Simone crossed her arms. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that the truth is out now, and you can't stop it." Ethan stood up, pacing, his mind clearly working at lightning speed. "You think this changes anything? You think anyone will believe you over me? You've been living in my shadow for years. Do you honestly think you can take it all from me?" Simone's eyes narrowed. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Ethan. I'm trying to take back what you stole." There was a long pause as he met her gaze, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he seemed to see her not as a threat, but as the woman she had become, strong, capable, unyielding. But that moment passed quickly, and the cruel smirk returned to his lips. "You think you can win this? You're nothing without me." "I'm everything without you," Simone retorted, her voice steady, a hard edge to her words. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind your money and power. The truth has a way of coming out, Ethan. It always does." But the battle wasn't over. As Simone turned to leave the office, ready to walk away with her hard-earned victory, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, startled. Ethan stood there, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You're not leaving with that file. Not yet." Simone's breath hitched, and a chill crawled up her spine. She had been so focused on the endgame, she hadn't considered the possibility that Ethan would play one final card. "I'll make you a deal," Ethan said, his voice low, full of dark promises. "You walk away, you let this all go, and I'll ensure your financial ruin is never exposed. I'll keep your secrets safe." Simone's mind raced. He was offering her an out, a chance to escape the destruction of everything she had fought for. But at what cost? "I'm not a coward like you," Simone said, her voice firm. "I've already made my choice, and you won't control me anymore." Ethan's face darkened. "Then you'll regret this." Simone didn't flinch. "I've already made peace with that." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, the sound of her heels clicking on the floor a steady rhythm, the weight of her decision pressing down with every step. The final battle was coming, but now she was ready. No more fear, no more hesitation. She was going to finish this, once and for all. Simone's steps echoed through the silent hallways of the building, each one resonating like a beat of a drum, pushing her toward the inevitable conclusion. She could feel Ethan's presence like a dark shadow looming over her, but she had made her choice. There was no turning back now. She had fought too long, clawed too hard for this moment, to let it slip away. The city skyline outside her office windows stretched endlessly, but inside, Simone's world felt confined, closing in on her. The pressure was unbearable. Every decision, every move had led to this exact point. And yet, even as her mind raced through the endless possibilities, she knew one thing. This was the moment she would either win everything or lose it all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the glass tower, Simone received another unexpected message. It wasn't from Gwen or Angela, both of whom she had lost trust in, but from James. The cryptic message simply read, "Meet me tonight. I have something to tell you." She stared at it for a moment, suspicion bubbling in her chest. James had been walking a fine line between ally and betrayer for weeks now, and with Angela's double cross still fresh in her mind, Simone couldn't afford any more surprises. But something in the tone of the message, something in the urgency, made her hesitate. Could James be trying to redeem himself, or was this just another trap? She decided to meet him, but this time, she wouldn't walk into it blindly. She had learned enough from the past few weeks to be wary. The city was alive with activity as Simone made her way to the bar where she had agreed to meet James. The neon lights outside cast long, strange shadows on the pavement, and the hum of conversation inside the dimly lit room seemed almost too loud, too overwhelming. James was already sitting at a corner booth, a drink in front of him, but his gaze was distant, as if lost in thought. When he saw her, he didn't smile. There was no familiarity in his eyes, only something darker, something heavier. Simone slid into the booth across from him, her eyes never leaving his. "What is it, James?" He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he took a long, deliberate sip from his glass, his eyes flicking nervously around the room before settling back on her. "You've been played, Simone," he said quietly. "By everyone, even me." The words hit her like a slap, though she had braced herself for them. "What do you mean?" Her voice was colder than she intended, but the hurt was evident in her eyes. James leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The truth about your mother, it's more complicated than you think. Ethan wasn't just your enemy. He was working with someone else, someone higher up, someone who made sure you never found out the full story." Simone's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an envelope. He slid it across the table toward her, and she hesitated before opening it. Inside was a set of old photographs and documents implicating someone she never would have suspected. It was the name on the papers that sent a chill down her spine. Gwen Riley, her mentor, her trusted confidant, the woman who had guided her for years. Gwen had been working with Ethan all along, using Simone's trust to manipulate her into taking the fall for the company's illegal dealings. Simone's hands trembled as she sifted through the papers. She could feel the ground beneath her feet starting to shift, the world she thought she knew crumbling around her. Gwen had played her from the very beginning. She had helped Ethan orchestrate everything, from the smear campaign to the financial sabotage. James's voice broke through her thoughts. It was always Gwen. She's the one who set you up, and she knew you'd figure it out eventually. She thought you'd be too weak to act. But you're not weak, Simone. You're strong, and you can still beat them. Simone's head was spinning. She couldn't believe it. Gwen, the woman who had shaped her career, who had been a mentor and guide, had been working against her all along. The betrayal felt like a knife to the chest, and for a moment, Simone didn't know what to feel. Anger, betrayal, confusion. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Simone asked, her voice shaking with emotion. James's expression softened, and he leaned back in his seat. Because I couldn't. I was too deep in it, too afraid of what would happen if I crossed Gwen. But you've become a force, Simone, and I couldn't sit by any longer. I owe you this. You deserve the truth. Simone looked down at the photographs once more, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Gwen had been playing both sides, feeding information to Ethan while pretending to be on Simone's side. It was a game, a high-stakes power play, and Simone had been the pawn, but not anymore. With the new revelation weighing heavily on her, Simone knew what she had to do. The time for secrets and manipulation was over. It was time to take control and finish what she had started. Her mind raced as she formulated plan. She had the evidence, the truth, and now she had one final card to play. Gwen. She couldn't just walk into a confrontation with Gwen. She couldn't afford to be blindsided again. She needed to be strategic, to be 2 steps ahead. She needed allies, real ones this time. James might have been a reluctant ally, but he had given her the truth, and she had no intention of wasting it. Simone stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Thank you, James. But this isn't over. I have to go after Gwen now. I can't let her get away with this. James nodded. I'll help you. You're not in this alone anymore. Simone nodded back, feeling the weight of his words. But as she walked away, a part of her knew that she was still alone in this fight. The last battle was coming, and it would require all of her strength, every ounce of strategy she had learned, to bring Ethan and Gwen to their knees. She couldn't afford to fail. The truth was finally in her hands, and it was time to expose the darkness that had poisoned her world for so long. The final showdown was approaching, and Simone was ready to face it head-on. The clock was ticking, and Simone could feel every second of it. With the revelation about Gwen and the papers implicating both her and Ethan, the game had shifted into its final, most dangerous phase. Every move, every decision, now carried the weight of everything she had worked for. The years of sacrifice, the pain of betrayal, and the relentless drive for justice. She had come too far to falter now. Simone stood in front of the elevator, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the button that would take her to the penthouse suite where Ethan and Gwen were waiting. The power had shifted, but there was still a sense of overwhelming dread gnawing at her. This was the final step, the point of no return. As the doors slid open, she felt the cold rush of air that always accompanied the upper floors, a reminder of the isolation that the tower symbolized. Ethan and Gwen had locked themselves away in this cold, sterile environment, safe from the world below. They thought they were untouchable, but they were wrong. Simone pressed her back against the cool wall of the elevator, her mind racing with thoughts of the confrontation ahead. She knew Gwen would be there, but how would she react? Would she continue the game, or would she finally be cornered, forced to face the truth of her actions? The elevator hummed upward, the city skyline stretching beneath her like a dark, endless ocean. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and Simone stepped into the penthouse lobby. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light, but the grand beauty of the space did little to ease the tension in the air. It felt as if the entire world had stopped spinning waiting for the inevitable showdown. Simone walked into the expansive office, her heart hammering in her chest. Ethan and Gwen were waiting for her, two figures who had once been her allies, now turned enemies. They stood side by side, the power in the room unmistakable. Gwen was smiling, that same manipulative grin that Simone had trusted for years. Ethan, ever the arrogant strategist, stood beside her, arms crossed, surveying the scene with a sense of superiority. Simone didn't hesitate. "I know everything," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the silence like a blade. Gwen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing. "Do you?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "What makes you think you know anything, Simone? You're just a pawn in a game you never understood." Simone stepped forward, holding up the stack of documents that had been passed to her by James. She let them fall onto the desk with a loud thud. "This is what I know," she said, her voice steady but forceful. "This is your game. This is your betrayal." Ethan laughed, the sound empty and cold. "You think you can take me down with this? This is nothing. You're nothing." But Simone wasn't listening to him anymore. She wasn't listening to the lies they had fed her for years. She was done being their pawn. "You used me, Gwen. You used everything I trusted you for. And for what? So you could play both sides and protect your own skin." Her eyes locked onto Gwen's. "You wanted control of everything, didn't you? Even me." Gwen's eyes flickered with something. Fear, guilt, maybe even regret. But she quickly pushed it down, her voice sharp and defiant. "You don't know what you're talking about. You've always been too naive, Simone. You think you can beat me. You think you've won." She took a step toward Simone, her eyes cold. "You've only just started to understand the rules of the game, and you'll never win. Not against me." Simone stood her ground, feeling the rush of anger and betrayal swell inside her. "This isn't your game anymore, Gwen. The truth always comes out." Gwen's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to reach its breaking point. But before either of them could speak, Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Enough." Simone turned to face him, her pulse quickening as she met his cold gaze. "What are you going to do, Ethan? You've already lost. The truth is here, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Ethan smirked, but the confidence was gone. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment, it almost seemed as if the powerful man who had controlled everything was finally realizing he had no control all. "You think you've won?" Ethan spat. "This is just the beginning. You think the truth will destroy me. You think that's all it takes." Simone stood tall, her voice steady. "I think the truth will expose everything you are, and it's over." But just as she thought the battle was won, Ethan's smirk deepened. "It's never over," he said, his voice low and menacing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, his thumb pressing down on a button. Simone's heart stopped as the entire building suddenly trembled. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of distant alarms. "Do you really think you're the only one who can play the game?" Ethan's voice echoed in the dark. "I've set the wheels in motion, Simone. You think you can just walk away with everything? You think you've won." Simone's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was implying. "You're trying to destroy everything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not trying. I already have," Ethan replied, his voice cold. "And you're too late." Suddenly, the building seemed to come alive with a terrible energy. Simone felt a rush of panic, but she couldn't afford to let it overwhelm her. She had come too far to be stopped now. She grabbed the device from the table, her fingers trembling, and with a quick press, disabled the signal. The alarm stopped, the lights flickered back on, and the building returned to its uneasy calm. Simone stood there, breathless, facing the two of them. Ethan was furious, his face flushed with rage. Gwen's eyes were filled with a cold, calculating emptiness. Simone took a slow, deliberate breath and looked at them both. "It's over. You can't win. Not anymore. With the truth now laid bare, the power had shifted once and for all. Ethan and Gwen had nothing left to hold over Simone. They had played their game, but now they were out of moves. Simone turned and walked toward the door, each step heavy but resolute. She had done it. She had won, not through force or power, but by facing the truth head-on. No longer was she the victim. No longer would she be manipulated. Behind her, the tension in the room lingered, but Simone didn't need to look back to know what came next. Ethan would face the consequences of his actions. Gwen would have to reckon with her own betrayal. As Simone stood on the rooftop, looking out over the city, the finality of everything that had happened began to sink in. The battle had been fierce, and the cost had been high, but she had emerged victorious. The tower, once a symbol of her entrapment, now seemed like a distant memory, something she had conquered. She thought about everything she had lost. The trust, the alliances, the lies that had been woven so deeply into her life. But she had found something far more valuable: herself. The city below pulsed with life, and for the first time in a long while, Simone felt free. The past was behind her, and though the scars would remain, they would no longer define her. Simone had won the battle, but more than that, she had reclaimed her power. The game was over, and now it was her turn to rebuild. Weeks had passed since the dust settled on the war Simone had waged against betrayal, deceit, and manipulation. The world that once seemed to spin out of her control had now fallen silent, as if awaiting her next move. Her victory had been hard-earned, but she had emerged from the ashes, standing taller than she ever had before. Yet, even as the aftermath unfolded, she couldn't escape the weight of the choices she had made. Her name, once tarnished, synonymous with the scandal and the conspiracy orchestrated by Gwen and Ethan, had become something else entirely. It had become a symbol of resilience. Simone now sat in her new office, the same building she had inherited, though it had taken on an entirely different meaning. No longer was it a cage. It was a testament to her strength. The glass windows gave her a panoramic view of the city, a vast expanse that seemed infinite, full of potential. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to the battles that had taken place behind these walls. But to Simone, every reflection in the glass, every streetlight glowing in the dark, was a reminder of how far she had come. There were still challenges ahead. The corporate world she had inherited was far from clean, and though she had wiped out the poisons of Ethan and Gwen, their influence lingered like a bad taste on the tongue. Simone had dismantled the structure they had built, but the foundation of corruption still stretched far deeper than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about the building anymore. It was about reshaping an entire system that had been built on lies. Her phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen, recognizing the name. It was James. The tension from their last conversation still hung in the air, unresolved. She hadn't spoken to him since the night they confronted Gwen and Ethan. His information had helped her defeat them, but the cost of trusting him was unclear. Still, she answered the call. Simone. James's voice cracked through the receiver. There was no preamble, just the raw sincerity she had learned to expect from him. I wanted to check in. How are you holding up? Simone leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city below. The truth, in all its ugly complexity, had set her free, but freedom didn't come without its own burdens. The new responsibility she bore was heavier than she'd imagined, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. I'm here, she said, her voice steady, though there was a quiet reflection in it. I'm stronger now, but it's not over. I've learned that much. There was a pause on the other end, a long stretch of silence. Simone could almost hear James processing her words. I get it, he replied. But you've come this far, Simone. Whatever comes next, I'll be with you. We've seen the worst together. Simone didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She had made her choice. James might have been one of the few who could understand the depth of what she had experienced, but even he could not carry the weight of her decisions. This battle had been hers alone, and yet, As she hung up the phone and placed it back on her desk, Simone felt a quiet resolve building within her. She wasn't done with this fight. She had made it through the darkness, and now she would rebuild. Not just the company, not just her name, but everything she had once lost. And this time, it would be on her terms. Days turned into weeks, and Simone found herself transforming the company in ways that no one had anticipated. She weeded out the corruption that still clung to the structure, replacing it with transparency and innovation. She brought in new voices, fresh ideas, people she could trust. Slowly but surely, she began to reshape the empire that had nearly broken her. And with every step, she felt herself becoming stronger, more certain of her path. She still carried the scars of the past, the weight of Gwen's betrayal, the cold manipulation of Ethan, the lingering doubts that had once haunted her at night. But they no longer controlled her. They had become part of a story she would tell, a story of survival, resilience, and redemption. Her reputation had been restored in the eyes of the world. But Simone didn't just want to be remembered for overcoming the darkness. She wanted to be remembered for the way she rebuilt everything from the ground up. Not just a company, a legacy. One evening, as the city lights twinkled beneath her like stars in a sea of possibility, Simone took a moment to breathe. The world had been chaotic, but now there was peace. And in that quiet, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. In the end, it wasn't the battles or the betrayals that defined her. It was the strength to stand up again, to take control of her future, no matter the cost. Simone was ready for whatever came next. As the story drew to a close, there lingered a sense of ambiguity in the air. What had Simone truly won? Was it the tower, the company, the power, or was it something deeper? Had she simply reclaimed the version of herself she had lost? The question lingered in the back of her mind as she stood there, looking out over the city. Power had a way of corrupting, and the truth, once revealed, was often more painful than the lies we lived by. But in Simone's case, the truth had set her free. She had not only exposed the darkness, but had also found the light that had been buried deep inside her all along. As the final moments unfolded, it was clear that Simone's journey had not just been about winning. It had been about understanding the cost of survival. It had been about learning the true meaning of power, not as a force to dominate, but as a tool to heal, to rebuild, and to move forward. The story closed on a sense of hope, a future unwritten, waiting to be shaped by her hands. And as Simone looked toward it, she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. The days blurred into each other as Simone worked tirelessly to reshape her life and the company she had inherited. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her, when the pressure of every decision seemed to carve deeper lines into her already burdened soul. But Simone, who had once been forced to play by other people's rules, had learned that her fate was now in her hands. And she wasn't going to let anyone, no one, control her again. The new office space had become a reflection of her transformation. Gone were the sterile walls and cold, impersonal designs left by the previous regime. In their place was an open, welcoming space filled with light and purpose. The color of the walls was brighter, the furniture more comfortable, and the air in the building, though still heavy with corporate ambition, now hummed with a renewed energy. Employees, once weary of their leadership, had begun to trust her, to believe in what she was creating. And that belief, Simone knew, was the foundation of her real victory. But with every victory, there was always the looming threat of past ghosts. Gwen's and Ethan's influence may have been erased from the boardroom, but their actions, like old wounds, left scars that didn't heal so easily. Simone knew that the system they built still lurked beneath the surface, and there were still powerful figures she had yet to face. As she walked into the conference room one morning, a sense of déjà vu hit her hard. The long, glass table gleamed in the early morning light, and the familiar hum of quiet conversation filled the space as her team settled in for another important meeting. She could see the trust in their eyes. They looked to her, not just for direction, but for inspiration. And Simone realized with a start that this was what she had always wanted, to not just succeed, but to lead in a way that was truly her own. Morning, Simone. It was James again, his voice warm as he smiled at her from across the room. Simone nodded, appreciating the calm presence of the one person who understood the depths of what she'd been through. James had proven to be a reliable partner in the days following the final confrontation. His quiet support had never wavered, even when the storm of public fallout from Ethan and Gwen's deception had reached its peak. Morning, she replied, settling into her seat. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. Most of them new, some with an air of skepticism, others with determination in their eyes. But they all shared something: trust in her leadership. Let's get started, Simone said, and the room fell into a focused silence. As the meeting unfolded, she felt the familiar rush of control. The projects discussed were challenging, yes, but they were hers to shape. There were ideas to implement, relationships to nurture, and above all, her vision to instill. The building was just a starting point. What she was truly building wasn't just a company, it was a culture, a legacy. Days later, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Simone's phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, but curiosity nudged her to answer it. Simone. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but had a sharp edge that carried both authority and an undertone of desperation. This is Michael Wallace. I need to speak with you. It's urgent. Simone straightened in her chair, a flicker of unease passing through her. Michael Wallace. She had heard of him, a prominent figure in the city's political and business circles, known for his connections and influence. The kind of person who, until recently, would have been an ally of Gwen and Ethan. What is this about? Simone asked, her voice steady but with an edge of suspicion. I think you'll want to hear this, Wallace continued, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. There's something you should know about the people still pulling the strings. Simone's pulse quickened. There it was again, the haunting specter of the past, pulling her back into the shadows she'd tried so hard to escape. I'm listening, she said, bracing herself for what was coming next. Wallace met her in a private, nondescript office in the city, far from the glitzy high-rise that now housed her new life. The air was thick with tension as he slid a file across the table, his expression grave. Take a look, he said simply. Simone opened the file, her eyes scanning through the documents, corporate names, cryptic notes, and an unsettling number of connections. But what caught her attention immediately was the name near the top, Luther Brands. Simone felt her breath catch in her throat. The name was one she hadn't heard in years, but it sent a chill down her spine. Luther Brands, one of the biggest names in the city's underground political dealings, a man whose hands had been involved in far darker dealings than Simone had ever suspected. He was the puppet master who had set the pieces in motion, the one who had remained hidden in the background, always watching, always controlling. Luther is still out there, Wallace said, his voice tight with fear. And he's more dangerous than you know. Simone closed the file slowly, the weight of the revelation settling deep within her. She had fought so hard to tear down the empire built on lies and corruption. But now, it seemed, the true architect of her torment had remained untouched. The shadows that had haunted her were not gone. They had merely shifted, moved out of sight, but still watching. And what do you suggest I do about this? Simone's voice was colder than it had ever been. She could feel the anger building within her again, that familiar fire rising as the pieces began to click together. I'm not suggesting anything, Wallace said. I'm telling you, this is just the beginning. Luther won't stop until he's in control again. And if you want to truly take control of your future, you'll need to face him head-on. Simone stared at the file, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 strategies. She had survived the worst of the storm, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle for a company or a legacy. It was a war for her soul. Luther Brands was a threat that ran deeper than she could have imagined, a force that could swallow everything she had worked for in a heartbeat. But one thing Simone knew for certain was that she wasn't afraid anymore. She had fought her way through darkness before. She had fought for survival, for redemption, and now she would fight for her future. As she closed the file, her decision was made. She would face Luther Brands, not as a victim, but as the leader she had become. And this time, she wouldn't fight alone. The door to the future had opened before her, but the path was not yet clear. Still, one thing was certain. Simone was ready for whatever came next. And she was going to take all. The story of Simone's journey was far from over. With the shadows still lurking, the battle was not won, merely postponed. But the woman who had faced down betrayal, corruption, and deceit was no longer the same. She had risen from the ashes and claimed her power, her agency, her life. As she stepped out of the office, looking once more at the horizon before her, Simone knew one thing was true. No matter the cost, she would face the future on her own terms. The battle had been fierce. The war was far from over. But now, she was ready for the fight. And this time, nothing would stop her.